Right, well, welcome everybody to Haystack Live from all around the world. I see there are faces from the UK, from Norway, from the US. We've got people from everywhere. So this is our meetup covering search and relevance. My name is Charlie Hull. I'm from Open Source Connections. We're the hosts of Haystack Conference Series. And we've got a fantastic talk for you today from Nick from Bonsai. But before we go on to that, just a couple of housekeeping points. So those of you who've been before will know the rules. If you please keep your mics muted during the talk. If you have questions for our presenter, the best thing is to put them into the Zoom chat, and then I'll ask them on your behalf at the end. I may ask you to clarify a few points, but that means everyone gets a fair chance to ask a question. We are recording the meetup. It will be available on our YouTube channel soon after the meetup ends. And there are many more talks from the Haystack series on our YouTube channel, Open Source Connections on YouTube. Few announcements. So we've got new training coming up. We've been moving our training onto the Moodle online platform, and the next training starts on the 1st of May. That's Think Like a Relevance Engineer for Solar. Do check that out on OSC's training page. We've also created a new training on search result quality. We'll be delivering that in person at the Haystack US conference on the 27th and 28th of April. And the big news, Haystack itself, the big US search relevance conference, we're hoping for up to 150 people in person and hopefully the same online. There's both remote and in-person participation options. And if you'd like a cheap ticket, you've got until the end of tomorrow, the end of Friday, end of March. That'll give you a discount on the ticket. Fantastic talks. We've got talks from AWS, the Open Search team, Elsevier Health, EBSCO, Get Your Guide. We've got all three authors of AI-powered search. That's Doug Turnbull, Max Irwin, and Trey Granger, who's also giving the keynote. All three of them will be doing a panel, Ask Them Anything on AI-powered search. Lots of social events, lots of other things going on. So do check that out and get your Haystack tickets and get them cheap before the end of this week. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nick, who's going to introduce himself and give us a talk today on effective relevancy change management. So Nick, I'm going to hand over to you now. Over to you.
Thank you, Charlie. Hey, everyone. All right, so I'm really excited to be here. I have been a lurker in the relevancy Slack for a long time, and I've been working in search adjacent, certainly, for over 10 years now. And this is not a relevancy talk that I'm going to give today. It's all the things that are going to get in the way of your relevancy. Because where I typically get involved with teams is when the system has not been touched for a while, or there's some kind of explosive growth, and there's some kind of desire to do things differently or to do things at a different scale, and teams find themselves stuck and having a really hard time making change. So this is really a talk about all the ways in which the system wants to get in your way. And just besides the teams I work with, so there are so many great search engineers in here that I've talked to that they have this experience where they want to go somewhere and they have ambitions to go toe-to-toe with Google or some other major brand in their site search and the types of results that they're delivering to users, only to find themselves just absolutely stuck in organizational politics. You know, capabilities that you need in order to be effective are spread out into different parts of the teams, and you find yourself just completely project managing your way around missing pieces of architecture instead of doing really interesting search relevancy work. So I'm going to go ahead and share a few slides just to walk through the first bits of this, although I do confess I got my time zones wrong. So I thought I had another hour to prep slides this morning than I ended up doing. So we'll drop back off and I'll have some expository speaking after the first chunk of this. Give me a second while I figure out Zoom. About that desktop too. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I haven't shared my screen on a Mac in a while, so give me a second to allow that. There we go. Great. Okay, just moving a few windows around here. All right, so how does this all go wrong? All right, so what does this look like? I think is a great place to start. We hear these stories all the time. I spent some time chatting with my team to collect some examples, and here's a few of them. So, hey, let's start with the basics. I want to add a new affordance on the user interface, or the product manager thinks that a new filter is going to help users find the thing they need better, or do some kind of a change. Oh, that change needs to add a feature on the document. It's going to change the syntax of the query that we're sending to the search engine. Well, it actually looks like we need to upgrade our version of our search engine in order to run that query, and so on. Like, we need to rebuild our index. We have to backfill. The backfill is slow. Somehow at the end of all this, search ended up worse. Here's another one we get a lot, like, the person doesn't work here anymore that built this search engine. Nobody knows how any of this works. And so despite that, though, like, users keep running queries and adding documents to the index. Everything's getting slower. Our search engine is deprecated. We don't even know how to make change if we want to. So let's rewrite it all in Rust. I don't know. This change management stuff happens to really high functioning teams too. Teams that are A/B testing, like, you're able to run a control and an experiment. You're able to attribute user behavior and actually measure that. That's amazing. However, A/B tests take a long time to run. What if someone wants to make some other change while you're running your A/B tests? Are we just kind of feature frozen until then? Are we out of luck? How do we speed that up? Oh gosh, here's my least favorite, the forced change management. Do we all remember the log4j 0 day that dropped? I certainly do. And sometimes you have to upgrade or risk having a very insecure piece of very important infrastructure out there running in the world. So sometimes these things are not our choice. Here's a fun one that I know the OSC team was wrestling with recently. I would like to upgrade to a newer version of my search engine, but I have a clever JavaScript component that serializes the query language directly into the syntax of the search engine. And now I have to change both of things at once. All right. So we could go through and derive, like, kind of analyze a lot of first principles, but I'm going to get to the punchline of this first. And I think this is actually a really interesting example of a kind of convergent evolution of a lot of search architectures. We see these kind of two very important, very common components. One is your data pipeline, and the other one is a so-called search service. And you wouldn't believe how many times I actually hear this called, literally, search service. Hey, it makes sense. It's probably a component in a microservice architecture, or at least it's a service model in a monolith. And they both do kind of the same jobs we see all over the place. So I want to break out the kind of what these components are doing and things to design for in a search environment where you need to manage effective change. All right, so the data pipeline, I think, is fairly straightforward to start with. This is where you are building documents and you are putting them in the index. I think it's really important to run a data pipeline through some kind of a durable buffer. And if you have to ask what kind of durable buffer, the answer is Kafka. If you have other opinions, then you don't need to ask. But write your documents into something like a Kafka. And then you have consumers that read the documents out of the buffer and they write not just to the index, but the next really important capability here is to be able to write into multiple indexes. Some of these changes that happen, you need a new document level feature. You need to build a new version of that index in order to begin the process of managing change. So this is one of the earliest things that you need to be able to do well, I think, in an effective search environment. Also, it's worth stating like it is very important to be able to backfill from a primary data store. We find a lot of cases where folks migrate or they have inherited some decision, shall we say, to treat the search engine as a primary data store. That is not an impossible situation to work with, but I think it slows things down. I think it gets in the way. So I just want to kind of put a good word in for the ability to always be able to backfill data from some kind of primary store. And if that's challenging, that's something that's worth thinking about and investing into. The search service, we get into some other items. This is where we take that user intent that is expressed and captured in the user interface, and we rewrite that into the query language of the underlying machine, of the underlying search engine. But when we're dealing with change, I think it's just like we have our data pipeline writing to multiple versions of an index. This is where we're now able to take that expressed intent and write it into two different kinds of queries, one for the current control and the other for some kind of experiment. Or if you're moving from one search engine to another, from Solr to Elasticsearch, we've done lots of those over the years. You have one query going to Solr, one's going to Elasticsearch, one going to Elasticsearch, one going to OpenSearch, one going to Vespa, going to, whatever this is a great place where we are now running the query two locations at once. And once you run two queries, well, you need to decide how often am I running both? How often am I running one or the other? And what am I doing with the results? Which we're going to get into here. So that's the punchline. I want to go back, just kind of rewind a minute and maybe walk through a little bit of the broader context of how we arrive at this pattern. So hopefully these are all fairly common or fairly common patterns here. The first thing we do when we're setting up the search is we're designing the interaction. We are studying the user, their needs. We're in some kind of a business context where the business is presenting some capability to a user to advance some need that helps them take some kind of action that is also in line with a business goal. Straightforward. We build that user interface. We have affordances on a screen that allow a user to express their intent. We take that intent and we interpret that. This is the query enrichment part of where is this person? What else do we know about them based on their session? Mentioned this before in the search service part, but this is now the point to build all of that into some sort of DSL, some sort of language where we are expressing things, translating from kind of our domain understanding of user intent into now the machine logic and syntax and structure of how to fulfill that intent. And then lastly, of course, we are sending that request. Of course, we need somewhere to send it. We have to build that index. Again, we are designing from the interaction. The search engine, an index is fundamentally a pre-computation of some query that we expect to happen later. So building the index should always start from the understanding of where the end state of a query and the results that are being presented to the user. From there, we have some sort of curation of content, the corpus that we are selecting from. There may be, relationships between the data that we have to traverse. We are designing and extracting features from these documents, doing enrichment of these features, kind of adding labels and translating values and identifying categories, all these fun things that the data pipeline gets to do. And then, of course, sending those documents into the search engine. Once we have those indexed, and the query, we send the results. We send the request to the search engine. We get results back. We possibly have a step where we're post-processing those results, applying further filtering or like a re-ranking, presenting them to the user for their interaction. And lastly, like the instrumenting that interaction for metrics and analytics and engagement. And at the end of the day, if you squint a little bit, we have some kind of architecture that looks like this. And I wanted to get to this point just to really like drive home, like, why does change get hard? And I think this is a software engineering problem in general. This is when you have components that are coupled together, tightly coupled together, I should say, a change in one may imply changes in others. So earlier we mentioned I want to add some kind of affordance in my interface to allow a different kind of interaction by the user. Okay, well, now I have to look at changes in how we serialize and represent that user intent. Changes to how that user intent gets reified into some sort of query. Maybe we need some new document feature to be present in the index. So now I have to wait for the backfill. And so now this one change may be spanning multiple different pieces of the architecture. And when you have different people on different teams, or even just one person on one team who's focusing on one problem at a time, in order to affect that change, having multiple components tightly coupled together, you now have a plan where that relies on things going correctly all together simultaneously in order to be able to do the one thing that you actually care about. And that just reduces the chances of that going well. So this is why we come back to the, the ability to have the investing into a search service and into a highly functioning data pipeline is a way of decoupling the changes that you want to have happen at different layers. So let me zoom in on the search service here, and this is where we start to run out of slides. So I may do some live diagramming in a minute here. So here's a search service. We're taking that user intent and we're turning it into a query that runs against the index. The job here now is to design a search service that can translate that intent into different versions of the query. And for different versions of those queries to run them against different versions of the index. And this lets you do nice things like feature flag if you're going to go from one to the other. That's a nice way to just kind of roll back. But there's a bunch of strategies. So once we have the ability to run different queries, like how are we running those queries? What are we doing with them? So, I mean, A/B testing, right? Top of the list, because this is the gold standard. You need to know how changes in your queries are impacting user engagement down the line. And this is measurable in terms of the outcomes that we want. But I want to point out a few others that I think that are really useful. I think if A/B testing is the gold standard, and we know that A/B testing takes a long time to run in order to gather enough observations and interactions to reach some kind of statistical significance. It is the gold standard, but the gold standard can be expensive. And I think there's useful strategies that apply to other kinds of changes as well. So sometimes you just want to look for identicality. Sometimes you are making a change to the index and maybe you're even being disciplined about those changes and you want to test whether your assumption that the field you are backfilling to your index doesn't make any changes. And so the standard here is identicality. And I know there's at least one person on the call here today who's working on exactly this problem right now, where an A/B test of a change that was expected to have no observable results did in fact have some kind of observable results. So identicality is really interesting when you don't expect change to happen, and it gives you an opportunity to look for anomalies and log those anomalies and see what's going on here. Let's compare one to the other. Where can we focus some engineers' attention? Identicality is kind of a high bar though, and like you might also employ it if you're going to upgrade the version of your search engine, especially like a minor version. We really don't expect that to have an impact on the model, although there are certainly like opportunities to be surprised based on some implementation change under the hood. But identicality, it's a high bar. So maybe there's some degree of similar-ishness that we can test for. And this is where there are a lot more of the information retrieval experts in the room here than I am. There's all sorts of different algorithms to score results that are presented in a certain ordering. So bring your favorite way of quantifying. But say, for example, you're using a control, you're receiving the results of the control, and you're using that as the loss function that you're measuring against when you are comparing your experiment. So fiddle with that, give it a score, give it a threshold, and now maybe you can permit some amount of results that are out of order that is tolerable for this degree of change and doesn't kind of spin a bunch of cycles worrying about, we know that, for example, doing a major version upgrade of our search engine is likely to cause some amount of changes, and we're just going to accept that because we want to continue to move forward and make progress. Sometimes you make changes just for performance reasons, and performance is a notable ingredient in relevancy. A search that is faster drives more engagement. A search that is slower increases the opportunity for people to churn, to get impatient, to, they're only going to run so many queries in a given session. And the more they can run to find the thing that they need, the more likely they're going to stick around. So some of the change that we manage over time is just continued growth in the incoming data or continued growth in the volume of traffic and users that are happening. And there are certain changes you need to make just to the server types or sharding or other operational components. And it can help to make those changes in isolation of each other, to rebuild an entire cluster even. And why not have a strategy in your search service that sends both queries and returns the faster one and log over time which one was faster. And I know that as someone who spends a lot of time helping our clients migrate and test and evaluate different compositions of their clusters to help with scalability, these kinds of abilities to move empirically through that kind of process really speeds things up and makes for a lot more effective change on hardware. Last but not least, this one's one of my favorite these days, interleaving of results. I think this is a really underutilized strategy. Even very high functioning search teams that I talk to I have not met anyone who's not actually already part of the Relevancy Slack group who hasn't heard of or tried interleaving. And this is, for those who aren't familiar, where you run the query on both sides, the control and the experiment. You get the results back and you randomly pick one to start with. You start with your control and you send its first result. Then you go to the experiment and you send its first result if you haven't sent it already. And you kind of go back and forth, merging the results from one side with the results from the other side. And if you can measure the engagement, did the users interact with A or did they interact with B? You have the opportunity to evaluate the quality of the results much more cheaply than a full-on A/B test. It takes a lot less traffic and engagement to give you some kind of a signal of which of these is presenting better. And an interleaving test, for the list on the screen here, isn't necessarily going to tell you anything about performance because you're waiting for both to respond, but it's a very pragmatic way of covering the sort of similarity or identicality. If you're able to run both queries, interleave those results, and you're observing that both of the models are being interacted with roughly equally, then you have a pretty good indication that the change is similar or identical in cases where you want changes to be no ops. And of course, in cases where you do want changes to have some kind of change, improvement to the relevancy and engagement, interleaving is a nice early signal about whether the experiment is doing what you expect it to be doing. So point there being is that can serve as multiple different strategies, so long as you're willing to effectively double your traffic against your search engines. So this is kind of where I can pause. I mean, I've been going for a solid, 20 something minutes here. And I'm happy to kind of take questions because this is where I am out of slides and can switch over to more dynamic diagramming. I wonder if we've got anything for me so far, Charlie.
Not so far, Nick. We've got, do you want everyone to have a think about a question for Nick?
I've got plenty of other examples of different kinds of changes that happen. So we could always kind of go through the list and if people find it useful to know where the canary in the coal mine is.
Andy, you've got a question. Why don't you ask your question?
Just a quick one. You know, I imagine you're very aware of this fuss around language models, particularly around ChatGPT, although obviously those have been used for a while now, you know, with Burton, etc. Do language models have any effect on this? Is this adding an extra layer of complication to this process that you're describing?
That's a great question. I mean, this is partly why I've been thinking about this topic lately, is to start to deconstruct and look at like where can we best, and I think that's kind of an open question right now, is like where best can we use language models. I think it's a classical potentially step in your document enrichment. So you have some sort of incoming corpus and you ask these language models to generate labels. We've also seen interesting work on using language models to synthesize test queries. So maybe you're doing some kinds of offline testing and training and using the language models to kind of drive some of that process. So I think if anything, just being in a season of lots of potential new tools in the mix, what I'm hoping to harness is just a little more appetite for the software engineering side of search in order to create more vectors of control of change of the process. Because I'm not sure like where exactly language models fit best into the process. And I think a lot of teams are trying to answer that and evaluate for themselves. So another great example of that is going to be you have just vector embeddings and you want to use Lucene 9 index. And that means building another version of the index. And now you have the two indexes and you're going to build another version of the query that has a some sort of vector embedding distance as a pre-filter or post-filter in a Lucene query, right? So introducing those kinds of capabilities are exactly the kind of thing that I don't know that language models specifically, other than presenting the opportunity to do things differently in different places, now kind of continues to raise the bar on our ability to build and experiment with different kinds and structures of indexes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You put your hand up if you had another question for Nick at this point.
Something else I'm thinking about, another reason that's kind of motivating this change is I would love to, you know, again, part of my spirit of bringing, kind of having this talk, having this conversation with different teams is I really do think that like search engineering does get slowed down by this change management stuff. And I don't know if anyone has any examples to share of where this has affected them. That would be interesting as well. But I'd love to be thinking and writing and sharing more about this too. So, and really trying to translate into the more pragmatic effects of how we can continue to accelerate our ability to change. So I'd love stories. And if folks think about stories off the call too, happy to make myself available for some more one-on-one conversations too.
So I've got a follow-up question, maybe just to Andy's there, maybe just to drive the conversation along. So obviously, you know, I mean, your where you work is providing hosted search to take some of that burden of the operations side of search away from people. And I'm wondering whether again, some of these new technologies, how you see that impacting what you're providing to people.
Great question. And yeah, that's so I sort of dove straight into the content and didn't do too much of the intro for myself. So what I've been doing in search for the last 10 plus years is I run a small search engine management and hosting company called One More Cloud. We've got two products: Web Solar, which is a managed solar, and Bonsai, which is Elasticsearch, OpenSearch, and a bit of Solar Cloud. So my background's as an engineer. I've done work in different search products kind of earlier on, the kind of late aughts. And I come from being stuck just from deploying these search engines and creating a cluster that can be high availability and resilient and self-healing and all of those things. So that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years, because my mission is to make it easier for engineers to build really high functioning and effective search experiences. So yeah, for us, this is a lot of cluster orchestration. It's managing thousands of different clusters. Right now, we probably run 20,000 Elasticsearch clusters alone, and several dozens of those at an extremely high scale. We're talking, at least one cluster I was looking at just a few days ago has over 1 trillion documents in it. We have clusters that do 1 billion queries a day. So that's kind of the angle that we see the change management from. It's usually folks who are struggling to make changes to the actual underlying server composition, and rebuilding an index ends up being a very expensive proposition. And it takes days or even weeks sometimes to add a new feature to an index and to backfill that. And so the ability to multiplex at those scales and to build 2 indexes at once is not even really optional at that point. That is table stakes capability for a high functioning team. So we get to see a lot of these patterns, and part of what we do then also is percolate that knowledge throughout. And we have monthly calls with our enterprise clients where we are just having Q&A with folks and brainstorming, where the next project may be on their roadmap. And we can bring a lot of our experiences seeing and supporting lots of different use cases and kind of finding the patterns between them. And these patterns that, as far as being able to effectively manage changes, is definitely, it's a process of learning together and trying things out, making recommendations to other teams, seeing how that works, and so on. So that's kind of the
that's the background. I think what I was thinking is, I think we've got a collision here between two worlds. We've got the world of search, and we've got people like yourself helping make that maybe less painful, I won't say painless, to stand up these systems and cope with loads and scale and deal with issues. And then we've got the world of machine learning, which has all its giant models and all that stuff's got to be managed somehow. And the two are colliding. So are we going to see people coming to you and saying, yeah, we know you can do Solar Elasticsearch hosting, but we've now got all these other systems here that support them, that are generating these huge models, and they've got to be retrained. They need to host the data for training them. Is that going to be the next thing you're going to have to add, or we're all going to have to add to our portfolio?
Gosh, yeah, that's a great question. And ML ops is kind of such an interesting, huge, and rising part of the platforms we're working with. And I think we are still in the early stages of learning what this all looks like. What we see is we have teams where there's a search team often collaborating with a data science team. And I think there are organizational parts to change management that I didn't necessarily touch on in my prepared content. But I think having ways of, so there's like the knowledge side of that question. Who's doing the machine learning? Who's building the models? How are we kind of bringing together that discipline with the sort of information retrieval side of search, the sort of user experience and design side of search? I think the machine learning side is very interesting because, like search, it is also very data heavy. And a lot of what gets in the way of managing change is being able to capture a lot of raw data, process through that data, build things with it. So, I've emphasized a lot of these building multiple versions of an index because this is the part that takes a long time, is you have to run through a lot of computation in order to restructure and organize the index data on the disk in the way that it is. So I would love to see and kind of unpack more of these. I think there's also a lot of different tools and technologies that happen in machine learning, and this is an area where I'm still learning. I would not claim to be a machine learning engineer myself, other than knowing the basics of kind of where this overlaps with search. So I mean, I think it's inevitable that we're going to be having a lot more use of what machine learning approach to search. I think building decision trees using tools like learning to rank. I think you close the loop on like any of these changes. I mentioned A/B testing multiple times in here. You're gathering lots of data, more and more fine-grained user interactions with the interface, and you're using those interactions to train some sort of a model. So I think that's unifying over time. I know the OpenSearch team has kind of put out a call for interviews on how people are gathering and logging and measuring engagement data in order to, I hope, build some kind of a standard on how people are doing this in OpenSearch that may start to translate into the broader search world. So I think we're still, in the early days where a lot of teams are doing these things from the perspective of solving the business problems they have for themselves. And I think what I'm wanting to see and am in the early stages of experiencing as a hosting provider that manages the search engine side of this is, asking for help around what are other teams doing? Where are standards emerging? What are the most popular products or tools or off-the-shelves components that teams who are new to these types of practices can bring into their search teams, or what kind of teams they should be building even, or hiring for even. Kind of a long-winded answer to say I think we're still in early days where we're moving from a lot of different disparate custom implementations into what I hope to be more emergent standardization of our practices and tools.
Thank you. So who else has got a question for Nick? I think we've stunned them into silence.
I guess so. Explained it better than I thought I would, then, I guess.
Wonderful. It's your last chance now.
Well, if I gave anyone anything new to think about and you have more questions, definitely feel free to email me. I'll just drop my email right here in the chat. nick@bonsai.io. Or honestly, if this all kind of rings true, ironically, I think if it does ring true from us, we all know that good experience comes from bad experiences in the past. So we may have other teams who we have formerly worked with who may benefit from hearing some of these ideas. So whatever the case, I'm very interested in kind of exploring the topic of change management at scale. We'll get more into that.
Right. Well, we've got one last question.
Joel asked a question.
From Joel. Yes. What's the most exciting thing you expect to see in search in the next 5 years?
Oh, man, that's a great one. I mean, I think like everyone, I'm extremely excited about large language models right now and the ability to take less structured forms of text and do fun things with vectors. I think we're going to see a sequence of better optimizations in how we are utilizing vectors in these pre-computed forms in our indexes. And I think we will see better converging practices and tools in how we build models that produce and use them. So I just think that these techniques are going to continue to get commoditized and used, where right now there may be hesitation on how much does it cost in terms of skills and tools and just raw performance and power. Those types of questions will get optimized away, and we'll see modes of searching that are very high functioning in smaller and smaller use cases. I think even small deployments of search are going to be doing things in 5 years that just 3 or 4 years ago may have even not have been conceived as being possible. So.
Okay, well, we have a follow-up question. Thank you, Mohammed, who's attempting to take you another direction. What else do you think, apart from vector search, could get into the limelight in the near future?
Mm-hmm.
It can't be all about vectors, surely.
Can't be all about vectors. I agree. Well, here's, I'm going to go an interesting direction on this too, is I find that we really enjoy these cutting edge tools and techniques. Vector search is a great example. And the more that I've been learning about, especially the machine learning side of search, the more I realize that it's just such the tip of, at least my knowledge of it is such the tip of the iceberg. But I think being experts, we can sometimes lose track of the basics. I think I remember a great anecdote that a team that wanted to achieve a 40% increase in relevancy, and they did that, or half of it, just by improving the interface, improving the layout of the affordances. And I think returning to the roots of how do we design for and build really delightful search experiences from the user affordance side. I always remember the first time I saw on Airbnb, they presented a range filter that had a histogram in it. I just thought that was like for a price, or probably a price, yeah. And I thought that was such a clever, that was the first time I had seen that was on Airbnb. And I just thought it was so extremely clever and honestly very thoughtful and compassionate towards the user. So I'm always hoping that novel and interesting and intuitive affordances for the user on the user interface will continue to get a lot more attention. And I'm hoping that the democratization of these kinds of search tools, I really think that one of the amazing things about really advanced technologies is they tend to make computers operate a little bit more along the lines of what someone who's not an expert might naively expect. So someone wants to just talk to the computer, and we're reaching a point where we've gone through a whole decades of the experts saying, no, that's really hard, and here's why. And now it's, well, the experts saying, well, that's actually possible now. So in some ways, I hope to see that continued democratization of these really advanced tools and techniques, then bringing the focus kind of back up the value chain, higher and closer to the user, the end user, and their actual tactile experience of the search. So that's not so much, maybe that's partly a prediction on my part, but it's also partly an intention or an ambition on my part to help channel people's focus there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nick. That's been a fascinating chat. And we will be back with a future Haystack Live soon. So we are lacking a next talk for Haystack Live. So if you're interested in talking, or you know someone you can propose, please let me know. There is a sign up form on the haystack.conf haystackconf.com website. Have a look there. You scroll down to the bottom, you can submit your own talk for Haystack Live. We'd love to have you. This meetup does depend on your contributions. Remember, Haystack US, April 24th, lots going on. And I do hope you sign up. And if you could spread the word, if you haven't signed up already, that the early bird prices do expire at the end of Friday. That's March the 31st, tomorrow. And remember, our self-led solo Think Like a Relevance engineer training is on sale and is available from the 1st of May. So if you're not already in Relevance Slack, and I'm pretty sure you all are, do join. We're getting very close to that magic number of 4,000, which will be quite astonishing if we get there. This talk and all our previous talks will be on YouTube. Check out the Open Source Connections channel for lots of talks. So we've got over 100 talks now, all of a lot of different aspects of search and relevance. Thank you again, Nick Zadrozny of Bonsai, One More Cloud. Thank you again for your talk. And we will see you all again back here at a future Haystack Live. My name's Charlie Hull. I'm from Open Source Connections. We're the search and relevance people. Thank you very much and good night.